We have experienced 3 major nuclear power plant disasters. The first was 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania near Philadelphia in the United States. And that was on March 29th of 1979. The second was Chernobyl in the Ukraine. Some of you may have seen that wonderful documentary about it. That was in April 26th of 1986. The third and most recent was Fukushima, Japan, and that was March 11th of 2011. And our next speaker is going to talk a little bit about this most recent nuclear disaster. And that next speaker is Mari Inoue. And she is an attorney, was born and raised in Tokyo, Japan. And while working as an immigration attorney in New York City, she became active in grassroots movements against nuclear weapons, nuclear power plants, and issues related to nuclear waste. As a co-founding member of the Manhattan Project for a Nuclear-Free World, Mari plays an important role in organizing projects and events to raise awareness about the ongoing grave situation in Fukushima, and to advocate in the United States for the importance of promoting carbon-free, nuclear-free policies in order to protect the most vulnerable groups in our society. In 2011, Mari co-authored, quote, "Opinion on the measures to be taken by Japan and Tokyo Electric Power Company to address the destruction of health, environment, and life caused by the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant disaster," end quote. An opinion paper submitted by a Japanese human rights organization in August 2011, that was about 5 months after the accident. And that this requested the Japanese government to change its policies on food safety, decontamination, evacuation, radiation protection, all of this and more based on international standards, international precedents, and domestic law in order to protect the health and restore the living environment of residents affected by the disaster. Mari?
Thank you so much, Catherine. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you, Catherine and Andrea, for organizing this event. My name is Mari Inoue. I'm an immigration attorney here in New York, and also I'm involved in a nuclear issue since 2011. I'm going to pull up my presentation, and to avoid any glitches, I'm going to turn off my video. So my presentation will focus on people's ongoing struggle 9 years after the Fukushima nuclear disaster. Radioactive contamination in the northeast Japan, including Tokyo, and what it means for Japan to host the Tokyo Olympics in 2021. So what is Manhattan Project for a Nuclear-Free World? It is a volunteer-led grassroots group started in Manhattan in March 2012, which was 1 year anniversary of the Fukushima disaster. We decided to choose this name because we wanted to remind ourselves that we first met in Manhattan, and also we wanted to undo the unconscionable labors of the original Manhattan Project that unleashed nuclear weapons and nuclear power upon the world. And in order to meet our mission, in order to meet our goals, we organize educational events, publish informative material, support campaigns, educate policymakers, give platform to victims of nuclear disasters, and plan field trips to places related to the Manhattan Project. And the flyer on the right, this is available on our website in English and Spanish. And this is a flyer called "Nuclear Energy Undermines Democracy," and nuclear energy is not a solution to climate change. And this educational material, this flyer was created in 2019, last year, because we wanted to highlight that the nuclear industry controls the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and that vulnerable communities and marginalized groups are always impacted the most by the lack of strict safety regulations. So in the past, we organized field trips to places in New York City that are connected, affiliated, or related to the Manhattan Project, and also places that are radioactive. And the most radioactive places in New York City is located in Ridgewood, New York, which is near the border of Queens and Brooklyn. And about 100 years ago, there was a chemical plant that produced rare earth metals to heavy industry. And that was a process that produced radioactive thorium and other radioactive waste. And they're not properly taking care of the radioactive waste at that time. So they're just dumping the waste into the sewage system or burying in the ground. And there were a couple of explosions at that time before the war. And after the war, in 1947, the Atomic Energy Commission, AEC, which was a successor to the Manhattan Project, started buying radioactive thorium from the company. And in 1954, the company closed its business. But it took almost 60 years for the EPA to finally designate this site as a Superfund site. And we went there in 2016. And from the property next door, we were able to see those cans of containers with some writing saying that an EPA site, US EPA, and so on. And those wastes are just left in the open air. And this site is still highly radioactive, despite 2 inches of lead and 4 inches of steel that were put under the entire block. And we went there with Geiger counters, and we measured about 1.9 microsieverts per hour at a spot on the road right outside the repair shop. Right now, they have an auto repair shop at this site, and there is a deli next door, and workers are washing cars in front of the store where we measured 1.9 microsieverts per hour. And another thing, before we move on to Fukushima disaster, we like to highlight one of our annual events. We always organize a peace gathering in front of the Japanese consulate on August 5th at noon, which is in the morning of August 6th in Japan, which was the day when the atomic bomb destroyed Hiroshima in 1945. And we not only organize a peace gathering in front of the building, but also we set up an appointment with the representative of the Japanese consulate, usually with the vice consul or consul. And we deliver a bouquet of flowers. And also we submit an open letter raising concerns on nuclear policies that Japan promotes. And in 2019, our open letter was endorsed by hundreds of organizations and individuals, including dozens of US organizations. And we raised concerns about the ongoing situation in Fukushima and also the risks associated with holding the Tokyo Olympics in 2020. We also always request Japanese government to play an important role, leadership role in nuclear disarmament by signing and ratifying the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and also support the peace process on the Korean Peninsula. And I want to highlight this divestment campaign, which is very successful in anti-nuclear weapons movement, and perhaps anti-nuclear energy movement can also think about how we can do this. So what is nuclear disaster? Fukushima nuclear disaster was a nuclear accident at Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant in Fukushima Prefecture, Japan. And it was the plant was owned by Tokyo Electric Power Company, which is not just a utility company, but the largest and one of the most influential corporations in Japan. And the nuclear disaster started on March 11th, 2011, after a huge earthquake hit the area, damaging the electricity supply to the reactor's cooling system. And soon after the earthquake, 13 or 14 meter high tsunami that swept over the facility's 10 meter high seawall, damaging the emergency generators. And as a result, Fukushima Daiichi lost its control over reactor's core. And a state of nuclear emergency was declared around Fukushima Daiichi in the evening on the same day of March 11th as a precaution. When the declaration was issued, the Prime Minister's office said that no radiation was leaking from the facility and the residents do not need to take any special action immediately. So they should stay home and remain in their current location and not evacuate. And the declaration of nuclear emergency was never lifted. And people in Japan still live in the state of nuclear emergency 9 years after the nuclear disaster. And under the international nuclear event, the nuclear disaster was classified as a level 7 event, which is the highest classification of this kind. And due to the lack of electricity, the Fukushima Daiichi lost its ability to cool the reactor's cores. And as a result, 3 nuclear reactors experienced a nuclear meltdown. And there were hydrogen explosions at 3 reactors, reactor 1, reactor 2, reactor 3, and reactor 4 experienced fire damage. As a result, a large amount of radioactivity was released into the environment. And even today, TEPCO still doesn't know how to control or stop the continuing radioactive leak from the facility. And in July 2012, the Fukushima Nuclear Accident Independent Investigation Commission concluded that the nuclear disaster was a man-made disaster caused by poor regulation and collusion between the government, TEPCO, and the nuclear regulator. It accused TEPCO and regulators to the Nuclear and Industrial Safety Agency of failing to take adequate safety measures, despite evidence that the area was susceptible to powerful earthquakes and tsunamis. So the radiation release from the crippled plant forced the Japanese government to expand the evacuation zone. And first, it was only 3-kilometer radius and 20-kilometer radius. And finally, in April 22nd, 2011, the yellow area was also added. So yellow, pink, and orange areas were now evacuation zones at that time on April 22nd. And this was based on 20-kilometer, and between 20 kilometers to 30 kilometers, that was called prepare for evacuation zone. So it's not evacuation zone, but prepare just in case something goes wrong. And it was interesting because the US Nuclear Regulatory Committee, or NRC, and the US Department of State recommended US citizens to evacuate from 50-mile radius from the crippled plant. So 20 kilometer is 12.5 miles. So a 50-mile radius is 80-kilometer radius. And that is the standard, probably would not be applied here in the US. And the Japanese government set the boundary of the evacuation zone based on the exposure level of 20 millisieverts per year. And this is a threshold 20 times higher than the pre-disaster national standard, which was only 1 millisieverts per year. So gradually, evacuation orders were lifted. And as of March 10th this year, the evacuation zone is only the pink area on the right side of the map. And the green area, in those areas, evacuation orders were lifted. So because of the lax safety standard, many people, including children and pregnant women, still live in areas highly contaminated by the nuclear disaster. And let me go back to the previous page. I talked to several people in Japan after the disaster, and they told me that this photo on the left side, the hydrogen explosion at the Unit 3 reactor, they haven't seen this photo until years later. So it seems like this explosion was censored in Japan soon after the nuclear disaster, even though this was published by US media and Western media as early as March 14th, 2011. And due to the rising level of radiation released from the damaged reactors, approximately 165,000 residents were forced to evacuate at one point from the communities surrounding the crippled power plant. And there are new words created after the disaster. One of them was voluntary evacuees, which refers to people from communities outside the official evacuation zones. And this new word was created to distinguish them from official evacuees whose towns were designated within the evacuation zones. So official evacuees are entitled to various public assistance and financial compensations from the government. We still don't know how many voluntary evacuees are displaced due to the nuclear disaster because there's no public record on this kind. And another word which was created after the nuclear disaster was mother-child evacuees. In Japan, there are many so-called mother-child evacuees in which mothers have evacuated without their husbands to protect their children. And Japanese government does not keep accurate number or records of those evacuees either. And 9 years after the nuclear disaster, according to the official number published by the Reconstruction Agency, which is one of the national government agencies, still 30,000 residents continue to live outside the prefecture. But this figure is considered very conservative by local groups and scholars in Fukushima. And lifting evacuation orders comes with terminating public benefits for evacuees, such as housing assistance. So recently, the government has started harassing evacuees outside Fukushima Prefecture by repeatedly requesting them to leave public housing, charging double rent, and even suing them in court to force them to give up their place to live. So there were two important anti-nuclear energy movements that have started in Fukushima soon after the nuclear disaster. And one of them was a movement by family farmers in Fukushima. And that was on April 26th, only about 6-7 weeks after the disaster. 160 members of Japan family farmers brought their cows and marched to the headquarters of TEPCO in Tokyo. And family farmers demanded TEPCO clean up their farmland that were contaminated with radioactivity released from the crippled power plant. And another movement took place around the same time in April 2011, was by a group of young mothers who started a group which is now called Fukushima Network to protect children from radiation exposure. And these mothers are ordinary mothers who just wanted to protect their children from radiation exposure after the disaster. So on May 23rd, that was about 2 months after the disaster, more than 500 parents marched to the Ministry of Education, Culture, Sports, Science, and Technology in Tokyo and demanded the government to implement stricter safety standard of radiation exposure for children. And they demanded that 20 millisieverts per year standard has to be returned back to the original 1 millisieverts per year standard for children in school. And young mothers didn't stop there, and they started to study physics, biology, and medical science, and started a movement for young mothers as citizen scientists. And they were disappointed by national government's inaction to protect their people, and many parents started radiation measurement by themselves using Geiger counters. And after that, by fall of 2011, anti-nuclear demonstrations in front of the Prime Minister's official residence in Tokyo were held weekly on Friday evenings. And thanks to their effort, all nuclear power plants in Japan were briefly shut down on May 5th, 2012, due to routine inspections, which happened to be Children's Day. But Inoue nuclear power plant was restarted on June 17th, 2012, which was less than 6 weeks later. And it happened to be Father's Day. How symbolic is that? And estimated 150,000 people attended the demonstration in the summer of 2012 to oppose the restart of the nuclear power plant. And this is historical because anti-nuclear demonstration of any size was very rare before the disaster. So the food safety standard after Fukushima disaster was proposed or was published on March 17th, 2011 by Minister of Health, which was only 6 days after the disaster. Before the disaster, there was no food safety standard for food that were contaminated with radionuclide. So the initial food safety standard said that up to 500 becquerels per kilogram in terms of radioactive cesium, pregnant women or children can eat food. But this standard was extremely contaminated because before the disaster, there was a standard called clearance level to distinguish nuclear waste from regular waste. And that was 100 becquerels per kilogram in terms of radioactive cesium. So that standard was respected for years. And basically, this 500 becquerels per kilogram standard was saying that you can give radioactive waste to pregnant women and children, and that is not acceptable. So after the huge outcry from the public, including human rights organizations and local groups, Japanese government introduced stricter standard, which took another year as a transition phase. So basically it took almost 2 years after the disaster to implement stricter standard. So the current standard is 100 becquerels per kilogram for general food in terms of radioactive cesium. So after the accident, people were concerned about the health and safety of the food that they consume because food safety standard was not strict enough. And another concern was that the Japanese government did not carry out enough soil measurements of contaminated land after the disaster. So they only carried out the soil measurement in selective locations in Fukushima Prefecture. But as we know, radioactive material travels beyond the prefectural borders. So driven by the desperate need to keep their children safe, a group of Fukushima mothers began testing food and water. And these women who had no scientific background built a laboratory from ground up, learning everything on the job. And after 2011, many independent radioactivity measurement laboratories were established across Japan. And worried about children's health, local people began asking these laboratories to measure their food that were produced from their backyard or vegetables or wild grass that they picked outdoor. And in September 2013, a website called Minano Data Site, where everyone's data site was established in an effort to integrate all the radioactivity measurement data into a common platform and to share accurate information on a single website. Because after the Fukushima disaster, the Japanese government carried out soil measurement only once which was limited to soil in selective locations in Fukushima Prefecture. And after that, it has relied on their air dose rate that was measured approximately 300 yards above sea level. So what the Minano data site did was they did an amazing project from October 2014 to September 2017. Over 4,000 volunteers were involved in collecting soil samples from 3,400 locations in 17 prefectures, not just Fukushima Prefecture. And in late 2018, Minano data site published 200-page all-color book based on the analysis of soil data that were collected using a standardized sampling method. And this book won the 2019 Japan Congress of Journalists Award, which is a national prestigious award given to groups or individuals with excellent journalism activities in Japan. And the English Digest book, based on the Japanese book, was published last year in September, and it's called the Citizens Radiation Data Map of Japan, Digest edition. Grassroots movement reveals soil contamination in eastern Japan in the wake of Fukushima. And a digital copy of this booklet, the English edition, is available from Minano Data Site's website. And since they're also suffering from the budget issues, if you could support them by purchasing the digital copy from their website, that would be a wonderful way to support their soil measurement projects. And we do have some physical copies of the, we do have about a couple of dozens of physical copies of this booklet. So if you're interested in obtaining one, reach out to us. So this is a map also created by Minano Data Site. And based on the soil measurement project they conducted over the 3 years, they estimated they measured the season 134 and season 137 in 17 prefectures in Japan in 2011. And based on that, they calculated how much radioactive cesium 137 will be there in 2021, 31, 41, and 2111. And this map was inspired by the soil contamination maps published by the Russian Federation and the Belarus Ministry for Chernobyl Affairs, which show the contamination in each province from immediately after the Chernobyl disaster and every 10 years until 70 years after the disaster. So in 2013, the Prime Minister Abe declared that the situation in Fukushima Daiichi was under control. And as a result, Japan won its bid to host the 2020 Summer Olympic Games in Tokyo. And the Olympic Games were postponed to 2021 due to the pandemic, but the decision wasn't made until March 24th this year. And there were a couple of concerns. One is that Olympic torch relay will start from the J Village Sport Complex, which is only 12.5 miles from the Fukushima Daiichi. And this sport complex was used as a hub to decommission and decontaminate Fukushima Daiichi, and radioactive waste from the plant was stored until 2017. And this February, the owner of the Fukushima Daiichi announced that the 1.03 million becquerel per kilogram of radioactive cesium was detected at the parking lot next to the village. So apparently they forgot to decontaminate the area after that, after using as a hub. And another concern we have is that Japan is going to host softball games and baseball game in Fukushima City, which is more than 150 miles away from Tokyo, and contradicting the name Tokyo Olympics. So if you're interested in learning more or hearing the testimonies by victims of the Fukushima disaster. We have more than a dozen of video clips posted on our YouTube channel. So please go to the YouTube channel and search Mahan Project for Nuclear Free World, and these testimonies will be available. And quite a few of them talk against the Olympics because of the ongoing situation in Fukushima. And if you haven't read this book, there's a wonderful booklet published by Fukushima Booklet Committee. It's called 10 Lessons from Fukushima, which is available in 15 languages. And for those of you who are listening and not able to see this slide, let me read a couple of them. 1, do not be fooled by nuclear power is safe propaganda. 2, during an emergency, the basic premise is to run away. 3, access to information and leaving record is vital. 4, people affected by the disaster have the right to a comprehensive health survey and disclosure of information. 5, to ensure food safety and protect agriculture, forestry, and fishery industries, citizens must participate in measurement. Information disclosure is also vital. 10, taxpayers are being made to bear the compensation costs. Another list I'd like to share is 10 strategies taken by the state, prefectural governments, academic flunkies, and companies in the cases of Minamata and Fukushima. This is a list created by Eileen Miyoko-Smith of Green Action Japan, and she has been following up on Minamata disaster and Fukushima disaster. And Minamata disaster is another industrial disaster that happened between 1930s, and it didn't become a social issue until 1950s. And there was a company called Chisel Corporation, which was a chemical plant and dumping the chemical waste into the small community. And a lot of people in the village was affected, had some neurological damage because of the mercury and other heavy metals. And let me read a couple of them, the 10 strategies taken by the state. 1, do not take responsibility. Use sectionalism to pin blame on others. 2, confuse victims and public opinion, creating the impression that there are pros and cons on each side. 3, position victims in conflict with each other. 4, do not record data or leave evidence. 5, stall for time. 6, conduct tests or surveys that will produce underestimated results on damage. 7, wear victims down until they give up. 8, create an official certification system that narrows down victim numbers. 9, do not release information abroad. 10, call on academic flunkies to hold international conferences. And there will be a featured film called Minamata, which is the Eugene Smith is played by Johnny Depp. And this is the movie that was premiered in Berlin Film Festival this February before the pandemic. And it's scheduled to be released sometime this year, hopefully. And I'm personally looking forward to this movie. And I believe that Michelle will be talking about Indian Point related issues. So I just wanted to say that Indian Point, that Unit 2 of the Indian Point was shut down on April 30th this year. And the last one, Unit 3 reactor of Indian Point, will be shut down on April 30th next year. So thank you so much for those of you who worked really hard to make this possible. So thank you so much. And if you have any questions, please contact me. And this is my email address. And also, please also find us on Facebook. We share some informative articles and information about nuclear issues on a regular basis.
Thank you very much, Mari. That was
Thank you so much.
a lot to take in. There are quite a few questions, but since we'll just take one, and then
Okay.
we'll go to our next speaker, which will be Michelle. What is the status of the children in Japan at this point in relation to leukemia and other cancers?
Well, we don't know about leukemia, but the thyroid cancer screening is conducted by the Fukushima prefecture after the disaster. They started from October 2011, and the children has to be 18 or younger at the time of the accident, but later they expanded the criteria, and children who were born on or before April 1st, 2012, which is almost like 13 months after the disaster, are also covered. And until you were 20, those children can get thyroid cancer screening every 2 years. And once you turn 20, you get only once every 5 years. But health advocates say that these screenings should be done at least twice a year. And based on this criteria, about 380,000 children, Fukushima children, are eligible to receive thyroid screening. And as of this year's data published by the Fukushima prefecture, more than 230 children were already diagnosed or suspected of having thyroid cancer, which is very alarming, because before the disaster, thyroid cancer among children in Japan was very rare, and they had only 1 or 2 per 1 million children. So having 230 already out of 380,000 is quite a high rate. Okay. As of other cases, there is no official routine screening conducted by Fukushima prefecture. And even for thyroid cancer, government is still not admitting that it's a cause, the nuclear disaster was the cause of the cancers. So it's very tough.
Okay, thank you very much, Mari. There are quite a few more questions, but I think we're going to move on. In the interest of time, thank you, Mari. That was really wonderful.